Hey everybody, welcome back to part 2 in my talking way too much about heaters for large tanks. Today I want to look at the heat pump that I pulled out of a floor freezer. I think I got it for $75 used, just Facebook Marketplace. And I don't have the footage of me actually pulling this thing apart anymore. I thought I did, but we've had a couple power outages and spikes, and it looks like somewhere in the process of computers shutting off randomly, one of my footage hard drives died. So I don't have that, but I can say pulling a floor freezer apart, basically you have to cut the skin off of the inside and the outside with sheet metal shears. You're left with a giant foam block with coils on the inside and the outside. And the inside is your evaporator coil, and the outside is your condenser coil, and you just have to really carefully cut the foam away so that you can actually get the things out. So I'm going to use that just to show you sort of how these work, because it's a little bit less clumped together than my design is. And once that's done, I'm going to show you my design. Now, I do want to preface all of this with one of the things that I am exceedingly good at is doing things that are terrible ideas successful. And just because I do something on this channel does not mean that it's a good idea for everybody to do it. There are a lot of people that should not try this. You don't have to do this whole setup yourself. If you want to try it, it's something where you can get the parts and you can have somebody that does appliance repair or HVAC repair come over and actually solder everything together for you, or run the wiring, hook up the electricity, those kinds of things. Don't do something that you aren't completely comfortable with. That goes for, I don't know, probably 50% of the things that I do. I've spent most of my life just doing weird, bad ideas. I grew up doing things like helping my dad build airplanes, you know, out of wood. So, I've got a lot of experience with things that are bad ideas. I've got a lot more experience with this kind of stuff than most people. So just because I've done something doesn't mean that it's a great idea. It just means that it works. If you're making a big tank and you're not comfortable doing a heat pump from scratch, you can buy a heat pump and put it outside, and it'll work as long as it doesn't get below like 20 degrees. The advantage of what I did is it will work all year round, so if it's 8 degrees outside, it still works. But if you have an outside heat exchanger, they usually stop working about 25, 28 degrees, depending on the temperature that your coolant is set to. So this one will work forever. The other one, I would have to switch to electrical heat for, I don't know, probably a month out of the year. That just doesn't work for me, so I went to the extra effort. But I really want to emphasize that. This is not safe for everybody. I'm not recommending that you do this. I'm just showing you how I did it. So let's jump over to this unit that I pulled out of the freezer. $75 on Facebook Marketplace. It was purchased with money that you guys donated on Patreon. Thank you guys for that. If you guys want to support us on Patreon to do some more weird projects that we otherwise wouldn't do, link is in the description. So here's the unit that I pulled out of the freezer. These things aren't overly complicated. You have a set of coils that runs out of the compressor, runs around, goes back to another set of coils, and then runs back to the compressor. And the gas in the coils normally, if it's off, is a uniform pressure, and you've got this little valve here that makes it hard for gas to go from one set to the other. So when you flip this on, what it starts doing is it starts to pull gas from this side and push it to that side. So this side becomes very low pressure, that side becomes very high pressure, and the high side is called your condenser coils. And it will take the gas of the refrigerant and condense it down to a liquid, and in the process it will get very hot. And the hot fluid will travel through the coils on your condenser side, and they will lose the heat. They will cool off. And then the colder liquid will travel up to what's called an expansion valve. And this one is pretty simple. This one is just capillary, and it goes from a very small tube to a much larger one, where it loses pressure. And then it goes from the large tube to a very small, very long tube. And this one, it snakes around this repeatedly, goes up, meets this tube, runs all the way this length. There's a giant coil of stuff in this ball of foam that I didn't pull apart. Runs back through to this other set of coils. And that small tube restricts the amount of refrigerant that can get through. So it causes a pressure buildup on the hot side and lets very little of the now less hot liquid through. So then when it hits these larger coils on the other side, it expands. And the expansion of it turns it back into a gas, and it gets very cold. So the hot side of this comes out about 140 degrees. It loses as much heat as possible. It's ideally about 80 degrees when it gets to this side, goes through your restriction, comes out on this side, expands, and drops below freezing. Because this is a freezer unit, the refrigerant has to be below freezing or it won't be colder than your freezer. And the purpose of the evaporator coils here is to gain heat. So if it's in a freezer, it gains the heat in the freezer into the coils, and the gas then warms up again. And the warmer gas gets pulled back into the compressor, where it then compresses the warmer gas into a hotter liquid. So you move heat from the low pressure side to the high pressure side. And that's the function of these. They're pretty simple. It's kind of a problem to get these if you want to use them for heaters for fish tanks, because they are pretty much always copper. So this one, I have coated the actual high side, the condenser coils, with Plasti-Dip. That doesn't actually insulate it at all. Plasti-Dip has about the same heat transfer capacity as water. So it's basically like not having a coating. But if you want to do something like this, if you want to recover one of these to use as a heater that's more efficient, you need to make sure that your coils are someplace that your rubber coating, if you use it, isn't going to get torn up. So this will work really well in a sump if you're heating there. It won't work well in a tank where something like a Placostomus may get on here and chew the coating off, and then you may get copper in the water, which can kill your snails, it can kill scaleless fish. Generally, it's something that isn't great. So that's the basic working of this. So in the case of a floor freezer, the outside skin is what loses the heat. It's what allows the hot side to get colder. In the case of a home air conditioning unit, it's the big blower fan outside. In the case of my unit, it is the fish tank. And the fish tank itself is taking the heat. So I've got my compressor unit. This is a brand new compressor unit that was old stock. I picked it up on eBay for $169. It's anywhere from like 1 to 1.5 ton normal use. Because of the design that I'm using, it's a little over 2 ton efficiency, but by design it's a 1 ton. So this this takes the gas and compresses it to a liquid that's very hot, which flows up and into my tank. Like I said earlier, you want to avoid copper. So what I've got here is aluminum fuel line, and I've joined it to the copper with some brazing rod, and then I've sealed it up with JB Weld. This works very well. It holds the pressure very well. If you're going to use aluminum tubing, make sure that it is high pressure fuel line. You do not want to risk this getting a leak or puncturing. If you get water in this system, it will compress it in the compressor, it will superheat, and it will explode. Not like rupture the piping, but violent explosion that can damage everything around it and can kill people. So, in order to avoid the problems of moisture, because when you fill this thing up, it's going to get a little bit of moisture in it, you have to add a drying assembly. This does not remove water from leaks, this only removes water from the first time that you charge the unit. After that, if you have to refill it, you need to get this changed out. So, hot goes in, comes out significantly less hot, comes around to my expansion valve. And this is a much more complicated valve than the one in the freezer unit is. This one is self-regulating internally, and it has 2 mechanisms for that. One is it monitors the temperature. So it's got this long tube here that attaches to the intake of the compressor, and it monitors the temperature by monitoring the pressure of the gas in here.
So as it gets hotter or colder, it expands or it shrinks, and it adjusts a membrane inside of this, moving it in or out. The other way that this monitors it is it monitors the actual vapor pressure directly. So here I've got a connection line to the actual intake that runs back around to the small intake on my expansion valve. Depending on the kind of valve you might get, you may have one or both of these. Using something this big, you can, if you very, very carefully regulate it, just use the little, capillary tubes to restrict flow. But these are a much better idea. These self-regulate, they self-adjust, and once you have the thing running, you can use this to then set your temperature. The temperature on your cold side is what really matters, and you set that by adjusting the actual pressure in here while it's running. So it comes through, expands, gets very cold, runs into this bucket of water, and this bucket of water heats the coils. Now, this is a much smaller amount of water than the tank. So every degree of warmth that the tank goes, this gets 14 degrees colder. And obviously, if I just let it run in this tank will freeze up very quickly before this tank reaches temperature. So the way that I've got this set up to stay warm is I've got a pump running out here. The line comes out the side of the building. It runs into the yard itself, where it runs the full length of the yard, pardon the mess here, it runs the full length of the yard and back 4 times, well below the frost line. And what this does is it uses the actual heat of the ground itself to warm that water back up. So the water in here in the summer is about 75 degrees. In the winter, I think it'll be about 55, but I'm not 100% sure because there's not any real data about soil temperature at any depth here. It should be above the 38 degrees that I've got this set for. So again, it goes in here, it warms up, comes back out, goes back into the compressor, and the cycle repeats. So this takes heat from my yard and transfers it into the tank. Midwinter, this will still be well above freezing, even if it's 8 degrees outside. This bucket, this water running through my yard, will still be 55 degrees. So this is much more efficient than a fan unit outside. This is not like boiling water, Iceland sort of geothermal, but it is still borrowing heat from the earth to heat my tank. Because this is not generating any heat at all, in the summer this is going to be using about 650 watts of power. In the winter, this should be using somewhere between 700 and 900, unless I have to leave it on for an excessive amount of time. At that point, the extra draw, the extra heat on the compressor, the extra cold in here that makes it harder to pull heat out, this may approach 2,000 watts, but that's the upper limit for the operating on this, so it shouldn't be anywhere close to that. Efficiency. This thing is, if you're putting in an air conditioner, rated for about 12,000 BTU, which is about 3,500 watts. But the amount of heat that it transfers depends on the difference in temperature between your cold side and your hot side, which means that according to the spec sheet on this, in the summer, this thing will generate about 26,000 BTUs of heat transfer. And in the winter, it should be about 21,000 BTUs, which is about 8,000 in the summer, 7,000 in the winter for watts of heating equivalent, which means this doesn't even have to run all the time. So I will be getting the equivalent of 4,600 watts of heat running in here continuously for only about 500 watts of power input. And that means instead of costing $3,600 a year to heat, we're looking at about $394 a year to heat, which is cheaper than this thing with no lids on it.
If you're going to do this, you want to make sure that your coils in your yard are well below the frost line. Now, most places, if you will try to run them for house heating, will bury them about 6 to 8 feet deep. I don't need to do that. The frost line here is only about 10 inches, so I buried them about 30 inches deep, and that should be plenty. I'm not going to be running a whole house cooler off of this thing or heater off of this thing. It's not going to be continuously draining the heat out of the yard. It should be okay. It took a while for me to get this up and done because I ended up having to do this entire process by hand. The water company here had no idea where my lines were. They made some marks on the pavement when we had sewer problems. They put them in the wrong place. So I had to dig this trench by hand because I didn't know where the last 100 years of pipe modifications were in the yard. And that just took forever. If you have a house or business where you're going to put this and the land around it, you're the only person that's ever had it, or it's only had one building, if you can be confident for where your pipes are, you want to go rent a ditch witch. A ditch witch is like $500 a day. You can knock the entire thing out, make very deep channels in your yard in 7 hours, return the thing, and you're done. For me, it was a couple weeks of digging because I had to do the entire length of the yard repeatedly. Not a whole lot of fun. But the savings overall, absolutely worth it. The unit itself is pretty noisy. That's one of the drawbacks of having this inside as opposed to having it outside with the heat exchanger and everything. I don't know if you've ever sat out by one of the heat exchangers. You know, when it kicks on and the fan runs, they hum pretty loudly. So I'm going to have to do some modifications on this one to try to bring the heat down, reduce vibrations. I'm going to have to get some sound insulating foam and put up a box around it to try to keep it a little bit more quiet. But it's not outrageously loud, it's just loud enough that I have to turn it off when I'm doing a video because it's a lot of hum. The other thing that you want to think about with this is these things produce a lot of heat. Now, the coils in this thing aren't very big. So I have to lose the heat that this generates pretty quickly, or it feeds back into it and things stop working right. If you don't get enough heat loss, then the whole system breaks down. So I've got several bubblers inside of these running circulation to draw water from under up through the middle of these, increasing the circulation flowing through them. If I don't do this, they get too hot and it doesn't work. That's even with the return water going straight past it and causing turbulence there. If I don't have the updraft through the middle of it, there's too much heat retention and it doesn't work. The other issue is these do get hot enough to cook fish. So you want to make sure that you have something that's going to stop any fish from swimming up into the tubes where they will get stuck and get cooked by the water inside of it. I'm going to be building a fake rock facade to go in front of it to keep the fish out that'll still hopefully let enough water through that it doesn't matter. I don't know, I'm working with some materials right now to see how well that works, but it's not the world's biggest problem. It's just some fish are a little bit less aware of that kind of thing than others. So that's something to think about. The last thing you want to think about with these is you have to do soldering to assemble these tubes, and you have to have a much better seal than you do for basically anything else. So even if you're somebody that's used to soldering your own water pipes and things, it's not necessarily good enough for this. Things that you'll need if you're going to do this: you're going to need a vacuum pump, and you're going to need a pressure gauge. You can rent these from an auto parts store. You go down to like AutoZone or someplace like that. They'll have vacuum pumps and they'll have these for redoing automotive air conditioning units, and they'll rent them to you. You basically pay the cost and then you get the money back when you take the stuff back. I put this thing together. Everything was great. I put it under vacuum. You can see on here, the green area is vacuum, the blue area is pressure. Over here the vacuum is much smaller, and then the red area is pressure. You want to pull a full vacuum. You open the valves to cause vacuum to flow, you close them to hold the vacuum in the system, and you want to make sure that it holds the vacuum for at least 5 days without moving before you even think about putting any refrigerant in this thing. I didn't want to mess with refrigerant, I didn't want to mess with anything else, so I called the guy that runs the air conditioning place next door to me, Rick's Comfort Solutions. They're great people if you're in eastern New Mexico or West Texas. They're wonderful people, very cheap, very reliable, very quick. I cannot say enough good things about these guys. Rick, the owner, came over, he gave my unit a once-over to make sure that I knew what I was doing as far as wiring in the electricity, wiring the start capacitors, double-checking that my vacuum was good before filling this thing up. He charged me, I think, $38 for the pressure refill, and then he charged me an hour of labor for double-checking everything. So it was pretty cheap. I could have purchased the refrigerant myself, but I would have had to buy way more than I needed, and it would have cost me, I think, $30 more than having the guy come out and fill it up and check it cost me, because I didn't need that much. But after we did this, we then moved it all around and bent some of the tubing to get it down in the barrel and stuff, because we didn't have the full heat exchanging unit for the yard setup at the time. And we snapped one of the solder joints, and this released the gas. It was slowly enough that we didn't notice, but when I went to turn the machine on later, it ran dry for a little while, and it got really hot, and it started vibrating violently, and it snapped a whole bunch of the other solder joints. So I went back through to repair them, and I don't know if you've ever tried to remelt solder. It doesn't really melt right the next time because there's no flux. So we ended up with this continuous vacuum leak in this thing that we couldn't really get rid of. No matter how many times I resoldered the joints, there were always still just microscopic leaks. So what I ended up doing was setting up my stuff, setting up the vacuum draw, and then I just mixed up some JB Weld, and I put it on absolutely every joint anywhere on this thing while it was pulling vacuum. And all of those little tiny vacuum leaks sucked the JB Weld into the little cracks, sealed it up, and now it's great. So that's something that you can do if you're going to do this and you run into vacuum leaks. You want to still solder it first, because that's a much better hold than just JB Weld would be. But JB Weld is safe to use, at least with the R134. I don't know if it's safe for other stuff, but the other stuff tends to be a lot more expensive, or it tends to be stuff you can't get parts for. So, like, don't go buying equipment on eBay for R22, because nobody's allowed to fill that up anymore. If you get something like an expansion valve for R12, you can use that with R134, but you want an R134 compressor. 134 is very cheap. All of the accessories and things were very cheap. The actual system was pretty easy to set up. I'm very happy with the design. I'm very happy with the performance. Again, other than the noise, but we'll be resolving that. If you live someplace that's warmer, you can move the entire assembly outside, punch a hole in your wall, and run your heating coils through. And you just get some of that foam insulation, or pool noodles. Pool noodles work really well. You just slide the pipe through it, run it up to the building, run it through the wall, put some more piping on it until it gets to your tank, and that will keep everything hot until it hits the water. Again, if you're not somebody that's comfortable coming up with those kinds of solutions on your own, you probably don't want to do this project. There are a lot of out-of-the-box heat pump assemblies already that aren't terribly expensive. You want to really spend some time calculating the amount of heat you're going to need before you buy one of those, because they can be $2,000 or $3,000. But spending $2,000 or $3,000 once is still a whole lot better than spending $3,700 a year. Or, you know, if you're living someplace more expensive, a lot more than that. If you're somebody that lives in San Francisco and you're making $120,000, $130,000 a year, $3,600 a year for a heating bill probably isn't outrageously expensive for you, but $15,000 probably still is. So, in any of those situations, the heat pump design is absolutely the way to go versus, say, bringing this entire room up to 83 degrees, which would be grossly uncomfortable for everybody, because this building, it's just one heater for the top and bottom floor. It wouldn't really be possible to just heat this one floor. That's it for everything today. We'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.